Good day to everyone. I'm architect Ricardo H. Cisbreño, an OFW from Doha, Qatar, currently a senior architect with Dimensions Engineering Consultant. I have passion in architecture history and classical architecture.
Today, as part of the 9th Career Simulation Seminar Workshop, we will be discussing the influence of classical architecture around the world, including in the Philippines. Today's lecture is intended for the Batch 2016 Senior High School Department students of the Philippine School Doha in Qatar. This simulation seminar workshop will serve as a guide for grade 12 students who wish to pursue a career in architecture after graduating from high school. The 9th Career Simulation Seminar Workshop is conducted in collaboration with the Philippine Professional Organization of Qatar and AFE-Q. Theory of Classical Architecture Learning Objectives. 1. To learn about the Roman classicism as the foundation of architecture and Western civilization. 2. To identify elements in classical architecture that have evolved from Roman designs. 3. To develop a basic knowledge in identifying classical buildings through an understanding of classical terms and principles of classical language. An architect came from a word archi, which means chief or head, and tekton, in which the word technical came from, which means builder. An architect simply means chief builder or a master builder. Question: is classical style of architecture a thing of the past? Then why do people love to visit Rome and see the old and classical buildings? And why do people love to visit Paris and see all those magnificent classical buildings? People love to visit Amsterdam for the same reason. And also in London. Classical designers believe that an art are not only supposed to be seen in museums, art are supposed to be seen anywhere, in our home, to the place we work. It has to be anywhere, and it has to be a part of us. Would you rather visit this building and have your selfie in it? Unfortunately, people study architecture in this building. This is the Lloydian Architecture Building in Stockholm. Our timeline for classical architecture are as follows. We will be discussing a bit about Greek classicism. We will be discussing more about Roman classicism. And why? Because Roman classicism is the very basic foundation of the Western civilization. During the fall of the Roman Empire, Rome was invaded by the barbarians and they sacked and burned the city. These are one of the reasons why Roman arts and architecture were totally forgotten. They were only rediscovered 11 centuries later during the Renaissance. And the last part will be the neoclassical architecture and contemporary classical architecture. Neoclassical architecture was a response to Baroque and Rococo in order to reduce the lavishly ornaments of the late Baroque and return to more pure and authentic classical style. Due to modernism and due to a strong campaign against classical architecture in the early 21st century, neoclassicism came to a halt. In the 1970s, there was an architectural revolution of a small groups of architects who started to design classical architecture as a response to modern architecture. It eventually spread until today, known as the contemporary classical architecture. It means we will not be talking about Egyptian architecture. We will not be talking about Romanesque and Gothic architecture. We will not be talking about Chinese, Art Deco, and Art Nouveau architecture. Before Rome became an empire, it was a republic. The initials SPQR, which means Senatus Populusque Romanum, meaning Senate and People of Rome. During the peak of the Roman Empire, Rome had conquered most parts of Britain, France, Spain, Greece, Byzantine, the Anatolia, Syria, Jerusalem, some part of Arabia, Egypt, and most of the coastal areas of North Africa. Romans are master builders. They have mastered the use of arches in their construction. What is an arch? An arch is simply composed of stones cut into a precise shape laid on a wooden frame in a semicircular form and locked with a keystone before removing the wooden frame and let the gravity do the rest. What will happen if you remove the keystone? The whole structure will collapse. By the use of these arches, the Roman managed to construct the aqueduct. Aqueducts are used to convey water. Due to the absence of modern pipe during those times, the only way you can convey water is to build an aqueduct. By the use of arches, Romans managed to construct an amphitheater. These are used for public entertainment and gladiatorial combat. Sometimes it is also called a colosseum. Why? Before, there was a colossal statue of Emperor Nero beside the amphitheater in which the people of Rome demolished it due to their hatred to the emperor. The Roman also built triumphal arches as a symbol of Roman conquest and victories. This is the Roman Forum, used to be as per the artist impression. During the fall of the Roman Empire, the barbarians entered the city of Rome and destroyed and burned the city. This is of what it remains of the Roman Forum as it looks today. This is the Pantheon of Rome. This is the most intact temple in Rome. It has survived the sack of Rome from the barbarians. It is now converted into a church named Santa Maria Rotonda. Before it was a church, it was used to be a pagan temple during the Roman Empire. Pantheon means pan, meaning all, and theon means God. This temple is for all the gods. It is composed of the rectangular portico and a circular temple floor. The dome is the largest unreinforced concrete dome ever constructed without steel reinforcement. The Romans were the first people who invented the use of concrete. The Roman concrete is a mixture of lime, gravel, and volcanic ash, which is called pozzolana. Pozzolana and lime, when mixed together, makes a chemical reaction that make a concrete waterproof. The Romans not only discovered the concrete, they discovered a waterproof concrete. The use of concrete was forgotten after the fall of the Roman Empire and was only reintroduced as a structural materials in the 18th century. In front of the temple is the portico. And where did the Roman learn how to do this? They learned it from the Greeks. The Greeks were the first people who designed the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. This classical column order were copied by the Romans and add additional two column order, which are the Tuscan and the Composite. The Renaissance. The Renaissance started upon the completion of the dome of the Florence Cathedral. The Florence Cathedral was first designed by Arnulfo di Cambio, in which he died without constructing the dome. The dome was later designed and constructed by Filippo Brunelleschi and completed it as the largest unsupported brick dome in the world. It was the same dome where the young Michelangelo, as a Florentine, grew up watching and was very much inspired, in which later he designed the dome of the St. Peter's Basilica. In 1416, a book was discovered by a Vatican archiver who found it in the monastery of St. Gall in Switzerland. The book was entitled De Architectura, meaning the 10 books of architecture. The book was written by Marcus Vitruvius Pollio. Vitruvius was an architect who lived during the time of Emperor Caesar Augustus. The book is made up of write-ups without any illustrations, but it contains the explanation of the fundamentals of classical design. In the book, Vitruvius mentioned that architecture must meet three requirements: firmitas, utilitas, and venestas, meaning firm, commodity, and delight. What does it mean? It means that the building must be firm, strong, structurally sound. Commodity means the building has to be useful in accordance with the requirements of people who used it. And finally, delight. It has to be beautiful. I repeat, it has to be beautiful. This is an illustration by a Renaissance artist, Leonardo da Vinci, entitled The Vitruvius Man. Vitruvius mentioned that the man's center is the navel or the belly button. If a man stands straight and open his arms and hands, it will form into a perfect square. If a man stands straight and open his arms and legs, will form into a perfect circle. So what did the Renaissance architects do? they went to study all that remains of the ancient Roman arts and architecture and implement it as part of their designs. One of the architects who studied the remains of the Roman arts is Andre Palladio. He later published a book entitled The Four Books of Architecture. It was the same book that later the third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, read and studied himself, traveled to Europe and Rome to study ancient structures, and later went back to the United States and become an architect himself. Andre Palladio is famous of his work of the Villa Capra La Rotunda, which still stands today. Another architect who studied the remains of the Roman arts is Giacomo Barozzi da Vignola. He later published a book entitled Canon of the Five Orders of Architecture, in which was later published by William R. Ware in the early 21st century, entitled The American Vignola. Vignola is famous of his work of the Villa Capponi Garden in Tuscany, which still stands today. Another example of the Renaissance architecture is the Tempietto by Donato Bramante. He was later commissioned to be the first architect of the St. Peter's Basilica. Another example of the Renaissance architecture is the St. Peter's Basilica. St. Peter's Basilica was constructed for a total of 120 years and was handled by a total of 12 architects. The first architect was Donato Bramante, Michelangelo was the seventh, and Vignola was the 10th. The dome, as you can see today, was designed by Michelangelo, who grew up in Florence watching the Brunelleschi's dome. The two-side cupola was the works of Vignola, and the front facade was the design of Carlo Maderno. The facade designed by Michelangelo can no longer be seen since it was demolished when they decided to make the church longer. Michelangelo was an architect, sculptor, and painter. He is famous for his work such as the frescoes of the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, the sculpture of Pieta, and the statue of David. Another example is the St. Paul's Cathedral in London design by Sir Christopher Wren. Neoclassical and contemporary classical architecture. This is Benjamin Latrobe, known as the father of American architecture. Migrated to America from London and introduced classical architecture. One of his works is the Bank of Pennsylvania in 1798. Unfortunately, it was demolished in 1867. The design was with a portico on both sides and a dome patterned to the Pantheon of Rome. Another works of Benjamin Latrobe is the main gate of the Washington Navy Yard, which still stands today. Another example is the Virginia State Capitol, designed by the third President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was one of the American fathers who drafted the Constitution of the United States, in which the Philippine Constitution was patterned. Another one is the Monticello, also designed by Thomas Jefferson. Another one is the Lincoln Memorial in the honor of the former United States President Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was the President of the United States during the American Civil War, who signed the Emancipation Proclamation freeing all slaves in the southern states henceforth and forever be free. Another one is the Jefferson Memorial in the honor of Thomas Jefferson. The United States Capitol, the United States Library of Congress. Another example is the White House, the official residence of the President of the United States. Last example is the Pantheon of Paris in France. Question: how does it affect the Philippine architecture? As we discussed earlier, Roman classicism was the very foundation of Western civilization, and Western civilization includes Spain. Philippines was colonized by Spain for 333 years, and the Spanish has introduced classical architecture to Filipinos and was quickly absorbed and has become a part of us. When the Americans came, they introduced two types of architecture, Art Deco and classical architecture.
Philippines is the only Christian country in the Southeast Asia. The examples of classical architecture in the Philippines are as follows. The Manila Post Office designed by Thomas Mapua and Juan Arellano. Thomas Mapua was the first registered licensed architect of the Philippines with a registration number of 1. He later became the president of the Mapua Institute of Technology, which initially offered the course Architecture and Engineering. Today, it is known as the Mapua University. This is another photo of the Manila Post Office. In front of it is Jones Bridge. This photo was taken before World War II. The bridge was destroyed during the war and was later reconstructed. In the picture on the lower right, the ornament, which appears to be the goddess of the sea, was completely destroyed. The picture on the lower left shows the statue of La Madre Filipina. 3 out of the 4 statues survived the bombing during World War II. In the early 2000s, they were finally returned to their original places at the 4 corners of the bridge, although one of them is a replica. La Madre Filipina means the motherland Philippines. The National Museum of Fine Arts is another project designed by Juan Arellano. It was recently popularized by the famous painting Spoliarium by Filipino artist Juan Luna, which is displayed inside the museum. The painting also gained renewed attention through the song Spoliarium by the band Eraserheads, which was featured in the 2019 film Alone Together. De La Salle University, designed by Tomas Mapua. Manila City Hall by Antonio Toledo. National Museum of Anthropology by Antonio Toledo. Roman Santos Building designed by Andres de Luna San Pedro, currently being occupied by the Bank of Philippine Islands. Supreme Court of the Philippines by Antonio Toledo. Leyte Provincial Capital by Antonio Toledo. Negros Occidental Provincial Capital by Juan Arellano. The old Iloilo Provincial Capital, the Pangasinan Provincial Capital, and the Iloilo Museum of the Contemporary Arts. I think I'll visit these places someday and see it myself. Well, it's a pretty good idea, but before doing so, take a look around. Take a look at the contemporary classical architecture of the Qatar Cultural Village in Doha, Qatar, the Place Vendome Mall in Lusail, Qatar, Al Hazm Mall in Marquia, the neighborhood of the Kanat Quartier in Pearl, Qatar. If you think it's so hot to walk around, try the air-conditioned interior of the Villaggio Mall, Qatar. You'll see beauty when you see it. Simply by looking at this building, it looks simple and has followed the principles of classical architecture. In other words, this building is fine. How about this building? Sometimes you don't have to be an architect in order to realize that the building is beautiful or not. Maybe this building is too low. How about let's make it higher? Seems to be too high. In order to make a classical design, one must first know the very basic principles of classical architecture. These are 2 temples. The one on the left is a Greek temple, and the one on the right is a Roman temple. They look very similar, but there are some differences between the 2. Location. Greek temples were usually located on hills outside populated areas, whereas Roman temples were built within the city to allow easier access for the people. Entrances. In Greek temples, the building could be accessed from different sides, such as the front, sides, or rear. In contrast, Roman temples were typically accessible only from the front. Structure. Greek temples sit on steps called the stereobate, with the final upper step called the stylobate. The entire step platform is known as the crepidoma. In comparison, Roman temples stand on a raised platform called a podium. A temple is basically made up of a base, which is either crepidoma or a podium, then the columns, then the entablature, which means a piece of wooden board in which the word table came from. In the Philippines, we use this word as influenced by the Spanish, in which a piece of wooden board are called tabla. And lastly, the top part is the pediment. They said the angle of the pediment are usually around 22 degrees. The top cornice are called raking cornice, and the bottom are called horizontal cornice. The triangular shape in front of the pediment is the tympanum, meaning drum. The orders of architecture are known as the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. These column orders were later adopted by the Romans, who added 2 more, the Tuscan and the Composite. The Ionic order can easily be identified by its scroll-like design called a volute. The word volute means to turn, from which words like revolve and revolution are derived. At the lower left are the differences between the Greek Ionic and the Roman Ionic orders. The Corinthian order can easily be identified by its acanthus leaves. At the lower right are the differences between the Corinthian order and the composite order. Both have acanthus leaves, but the composite order has larger scrolls or volutes. The composite order is simply a combination of the Ionic and Corinthian columns.
These are the designs of columns with corresponding entablature for each of the column order. But for today's discussion, we will be only talking about the Doric entablature, which are very much similar with the Tuscan entablature. The Doric entablature are basically composed of cornice, frieze, and architrave. Cornice means curve, where the word crown came from. Frieze means a long decorative fabric, and architrave meaning arch or main, and travi means support or beam. It simply means that architrave means a main beam support. At the bottom of the entablature, right at the top of a column, is the capital. According to the book, The American Vignola, if you divide the entablature into 8 parts, the proportions are as follows: 2 parts for the height of the architrave, 3 parts for the frieze, and 3 parts for the cornice. Along the frieze are elements called triglyphs. I was confused about this for a while, because tri means 3 and glyph means groove. Yet there appear to be only 2 grooves. Later, I learned that there are 2 full grooves and 2 half grooves at both ends, which together form the appearance of 3 grooves. The spaces between these triglyphs are called metapios, which simply means the spaces in between. When I saw an illustration in the book Classical Architecture by Robert Adam, I realized that these temples were originally constructed using timber materials. Above the architrave, which serves as the main support, were cross beams or girders that correspond to the triglyphs, while the spaces between them correspond to the metopes. You can see examples of these entablatures at Qatar Cultural Village, where the triglyphs and metopes can be easily identified. One important topic you need to understand is the alignment of columns with the entablature. The entablature should not extend beyond the capital of the column. In Roman architecture, the entablature is typically aligned with the neck of the column. In Greek architecture, however, the entablature is aligned with the base of the column, meaning the entablature is visually aligned with the cryptodoma. Here is a closer look at the Greek alignment. The neck of the column is slightly set inward. What happens if you disregard the proper alignment of your columns? In this example, you can see that the columns are positioned too far inside the entablature, making the design of the column capital less noticeable. In another example, the column is offset too far outside the entablature, making it appear as if half of the column is detached. It raises the question, how difficult would it have been to adjust the entablature so that it properly aligns with the columns? Another example is a misaligned porch. As you can see, the columns below have a small overhang with the side entablature, which causes misalignment with the pillars above the terrace with balustrades. If mistakes like these occur during construction, you can no longer go back to the drawing board or your computer to undo them. The only solution is demolition and reconstruction to correct the error. And who will pay for that? Your client will bear the additional cost to fix the mistake. That is why it is very important to be extremely careful with your design and alignment. This photo is from the old Lazarus Mansion in the Philippines, now known as Angelicum School. Notice the proper alignment of the columns. That is how it should be done. In the case of the €5 banknote, unfortunately, nobody told the designer that the entablature should not extend beyond the column or its capital. However, the holder of this money is usually more concerned about its value than the architectural drawing on it. In classical architecture, building proportions are usually based on the diameter of a column. According to the book, The American Vignola, the height of a column should be equal to 8 times its diameter. The height of the base should be equal to half the diameter of the column, and the height of the capital should also be half the diameter of the column. According to Andrea Palladio, the entasis of a column remains straight up to 1/3 of the column's height. Above this point, the column begins a gentle curve. forming a tapered shape until it reaches the neck of the column, which measures about 5/8 of the diameter of the base. The height of the entablature shall be equal to twice the diameter of the column. The cornice should have an overhang equivalent to the diameter of the column. Once these proportions are established, it becomes easier to lay out and design the building. In the book The American Vignola, you can also find the different column heights according to the various architectural orders. Another member of the column system is the pedestal. According to Vignola, if you divide the whole composition into 12 parts, 4 parts will be the height of the pedestal, and 3 parts will be the height of the entablature. If you combine them all together, the pedestal, column, and entablature, the total height will be 19 parts. Here is an example where pedestals are not necessary. The proportions would look much better without pedestals and with a larger column instead. Here is another example where pedestals should not have been used. Now compare this with De La Salle University, designed by Thomas Mapua, where the proportions are more balanced. According to Andre Palladio, one of the best proportions for column spacing is the U style, where the distance between columns is 2 1/4 times the diameter of the column. The center space should be slightly wider, with a distance equal to 3 times the diameter of the column. In reality, there are no absolute rules in determining proportions. These are simply guidelines developed by the masters of the Renaissance, each of whom had their own interpretations and published books as guides to classical architecture. Think of it like a recipe for food. Every cook has their own style of cooking. However, you still need to follow the basic recipe. Otherwise, you might end up producing something that is quite difficult to digest. These are examples of the classical column orders, starting with Doric, Tuscan, Ionic, Corinthian, and Composite. Doric columns can be found as early as the 5th century BCE, such as at the Temple of Hera in Paestum, Greece. Another well-known example is the Lincoln Memorial. Tuscan columns can be seen in several notable places, including the 284 columns of Sangdina, Peter Square, the Tempietto by Donato Bramante, the University of Virginia, and Monticello, the home designed by Thomas Jefferson. They can also be found at the Qatar Cultural Village. In the Philippines, Tuscan columns can be seen at the Paco railway station, which is now partially demolished. I hope the remaining structure will be preserved, as it is already part of the country's architectural legacy. Other examples include Puerta de Parian in Intramuros, the Lazarus Mansion in the Loilo, now known as Angelicum School, designed by Andres de Luna San Pedro, and the Old Loilo Provincial Capital. By the way, the Old Loilo Provincial Capital is an example of mixed architecture, combining classical elements with the traditional Filipino Bahaina Bato style. At the rear view of the old capital, you can clearly see features of a Bahaina Bato. For example, the small ventilation openings located below the windows are called ventanillas, and the small canopy above the windows is called the media agua. Bahaina Batu is commonly referred to as the ancestral house. It is a style of arquitecturang mestiza, or mixed architecture, that retains the basic design of the Bahay Kubo. These photos show the transformation from a Bahay Kubo into a Bahaina Batu. Lastly, the Tuscan order can also be found at Kalayaan Hall in Malacañang Palace. It features a combination of Tuscan columns on the lower floor and Ionic columns on the upper floor. Next is the Ionic order. One of the earliest examples can be seen as early as 406 BCE at the Erechtheion in the Acropolis of Greece. This structure has a unique porch called the Porch of the Maidens, where the columns take the form of female figures known as cariotids. This type of design was also previously used in the Philippines. One example was the Edificio Troyson building in Escolta, which featured Ionic columns on the lower floors and cariotids on the upper floors. Unfortunately, we will never see his likes this again. The structure was completely destroyed during the bombing of Manila in World War II. Ionic columns can also be seen at the Garni Temple in Armenia. I included this in my presentation because I had the opportunity to visit this place about 5 years ago. Other notable examples of Ionic architecture include works by Andrea Palladio, such as the Basilica Palladiana in Vicenza, Villa Caprella Rotonda, Villa Barbero, and Palazzo Sericati in Vicenza. Villa Caponi Garden, Tuscany by Vignola, Villa Cornaro by Andrea Palladio, the Virginia State Capitol, the Jefferson Memorial. In the Philippines, we have the Roman Santos Building currently being occupied by the Bank of the Philippine Islands, the Manila Post Office Building, the Supreme Court of the Philippines, the Masonic Temple in Iloilo City, Leyte Provincial Capital, and lastly, the Pangasinan Provincial Capital. Next is the Corinthian Order. It can be found in the Arch of Constantine in 315 CE, Pantheon of Rome, 2nd century CE, Maison Cry, France, visited many times by Thomas Jefferson before designing the Virginia State Capitol. Facade of St. Peter's Basilica, 1626 CE. The Trevi Fountain in Rome. The Pantheon of Paris, France. The United States Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. In Qatar, you can find it at the Place Vendôme Mall in Lusail. In the Philippines, it can be found in the National Museum of Fine Arts. Negros Occidental Provincial Capital by Juan Arellano de la Salle University by Tomas Mopua. And lastly, to my alma mater, University of San Agustin Ordineta Hull. I grew up watching this building. It was in this building where I studied my elementary education for 6 years. After that, I studied high school at the same school for another 4 years, in another building, of course. And after I graduated from high school, I studied architecture also at the same school for another 5 years. So I studied at the same school for a total of 15 years. During my college graduation, I was given an award of loyalty to the alma mater. Last is the Composite Order. It can be found in the Arch of Titus as early as 81 AD. It can be found at the interiors of the Bath of Diocletian, which was transformed to a church during the Renaissance by Michelangelo. Palazzo del Capitaniato, Vicentia by Andre Palladio, Dome of Washington State Capitol. Motifs and details first. Let's talk about the pilaster and giant orders. A giant order are large columns that serves 2 or more floors. The 4 front columns of the picture on the left are the examples of a giant order. Pilasters, decorative columns that are integrated into a wall, sometimes load-bearing and sometimes for decorative purpose only. The 2 tall columns on the picture on right and the photo at the center are the examples of a pilaster. The pilaster on the right are serving 2 floors. Therefore, this pilaster is considered as giant and the pilaster. The 4 giant order on the left, however, are not integrated on the wall. Therefore, they cannot be considered as a pilaster. In conclusion, not all giant orders are pilasters and not all pilasters are giant orders. This is an elevation of a banqueting house. Whitehall designed by Inigo Jones. Without pilasters, the building will become boring to the eye. Then by adding a pilaster, they added a horizontal element in the design which makes it balanced and beautiful. This technique were previously used in the construction of the Roman amphitheater. And if you notice, the pilasters used by the Romans from the bottom to the top are Doric at the bottom, then the Ionic at the middle floor and Corinthian at the topmost floor. The aedicule. What is an aedicule? It is used in all ancient Roman houses. It could be a small shrine or a niche sometimes used to display painting or their ancestor, head of the family. Decorations or sometimes for religious purposes. Sometimes they are just simply painted on the walls. It has its own decorative pilasters, pediment and entablature. These designs were previously used as early as 110 CE in the library of Celsus Ephesus in Anatolia. It can be also seen inside the Pantheon of Rome. These are the cleared view of the aedicules used in the Pantheon of Rome. They can also use as a decorative along the entrance access of this bridge. Aedicules were used by Vignola in the decorative windows Villa Caponi Garden in Tuscany. It was popularized by Michelangelo in the decorative windows Portopilla in Rome. Michelangelo also used it in the tomb of Juano de' Medici. Inigo John is also used in the decorative windows banqueting house in Whitehall. It can also be seen in the decorative windows banqueting of Otokan Mansion in New York City. In the Philippines, surprisingly, it was used in the decorative entrance of a Bahain, Abato, and Albeto mansion at Binin, Laguna. It can be found at top of the entrance of the Fort Santiago in the walled city of Intramuros. In Qatar, you'll be able to see a lot of edicules in the Qatar Cultural Village. It can also be found at the decorative windows of the Place Vinda Mall at Lusail, Qatar. Furthermore, along the neighborhood of Kinakortir at Pro Qatar. Again, if you think it's too hot for you to go around, you can simply visit the air-conditioned mall of the Villa Jol Mall. In here, you'll see numerous types of edicule windows like this, like this, like this, and this. Now let's talk about the Diocletian window. What is a Diocletian window? It's a window that looks like this. It can be found as early as 306 CE at the Bath of Diocletian in Rome. The building still stands today, but it has been converted into a church during the Renaissance by Michelangelo. It can be seen at the Roman Bath in Somerset, England, constructed in 70 CE. During the occupation of the Romans in Britain, the building still stands today. It can be found at Villa Foscari, designed by Andrea Palladio, Chiesa del Zitella, Venice, also at Via Molen near Padua, designed by Vincenzo Scamozzi. It was used to be seen at the top of the old Penn Station in New York City in 1911. Museum of Natural History, Washington, D.C. In the Philippines, it can be found at the old Customs House designed by Thomas Mapua. In Qatar, you can find it at the Qatar Cultural Village. This is a Brooks Brothers store with Diocletian window at Beverly Hills, California. The way I see the big arch at the center and with two small arches at the side. This design was conceptualized from a Roman triumphal arches. Example of a triumphal arch is the Arch of Constantine built in 315 CE in Rome. It has decorative ornaments which glorifies the victories of Roman conquest. The Arch of Triumph in Paris, France, with decorative ornaments of the conquest of Napoleon Bonaparte. The Trevi Fountain in Rome by Nicolas Salvi was also conceptualized from a triumphal arch. In the Philippines, we have the Arch of the Centuries in front of the University of Santo Tomas. The main building entrance of the University of the Philippines in the Visayas designed by Juan Aradino, the Puerta de Parioden in the walled city of Intramuros, and finally here in Qatar, it's the Place Fendo Mall. Yes, it's a triumphal arch. The Palladian Arch. What is a Palladian arch? It is an arch popularized by Andrea Palladio. Sometimes it is called as a Venetian arch. Another name for this arch, it is often called as the Serliana. It was also popularized by Sebastiano Serlio. Serliana can be seen as early as 129 BC at the Temple of Hadrian at Ephesus, Turkey. Serliana are often used as window feature and as a porch. The wall along the both sides of the arch are called spandrel. Sometimes it has a circular hole and sometimes not. It was Andrea Palladio who popularized it in Vicenza Basilica, Palladiana. It can also be seen at the courtyard of Burlington House, Wilton House, Wiltshire, England. Clayton House, built in 1757. In the Philippines, it can be found at the top of Villanueva Building in Iloilo City. Unfortunately, the two rectangular openings at both sides are now covered with block walls. Again in Qatar, you can find it at the Qatar Cultural Village and more on Qatar Cultural Village. Also, at Place Vendôme at Lusail, Qatar. Perhaps this designer can't stop thinking of a Serliana in which he decided to put a Serliana all over the building. And that's what you called an overkill. The Syrian Arch. What is a Syrian Arch? It is an arch that looks like this. Sometimes it is also called a pedimented arch, and sometimes it is also called a pedimented Serliana. A Syrian arch can be found as early as 3rd century BC at the monumental gateway of the Aphrodisiac, Turkey. It can be also seen in the Roman Bath Gymnasium complex at Manisium, Turkey. It can be also seen in the Palace of Diocletian at Split, Croatia, more often used as a design to the house entrance and as a decorative window, edicules and porches. In Guston, Virginia, it was used to design to a house entrance. And lastly, it can also be found in the National Assembly building in Armenia. I specifically include in my presentation since it was one of the buildings I visit when I happened to visit the country a few years ago. Effect of modernism. In the early, there has been a strong campaign to promote modern architecture. Most of the architecture schools and practicing architects were also convinced and used modern architecture in their designs, in which there was a decline in the use of classical architecture. Famous influential architects like Le Corbusier, Frank Lloyd Wright, Louis Sullivan, promoting form follow function made a strong effect in the industry of designing new buildings. One of the most influential architect, Le Corbusier quotes, "A house is a machine to live in," and was also famous of the modular system, and Cubism has influenced most of the architecture schools. Most of the people also didn't know that Le Corbusier once planned to demolish the old classical buildings in Paris to change it into a modern building. To a building that looks like this. Thanks God it didn't come true. I'm not against modern architecture. In fact, most of my designs are modern architecture. But I'm against demolishing old and classical buildings. Another influential architect is Adolf Loos. He designed the building Loos House in Michelerplatz, Vienna, and said, "Ornament equals crime." He was against the idea of fanciful designs. When you look at the building, it would look classical building simply by adding ornaments. In architecture, that is what you called minimalism. Another example of classical minimalism is the City College of San Francisco. It uses a rectangular column instead of round. However, spacing of columns seems to follow the U style by Andrea Palladio. The building looks similar with the University of the Philippines Diliman College of Engineering. Perhaps the best example of classical minimalism is the Antikabir Mausoleum Complex, Turkey. The spacing of columns also seems to follow the U style by Andrea Palladio. It looks like a Parthenon and also like the Lincoln Memorial. So if you decide to become a classical minimalist, you should know what you are doing. This is Ayampay. In Qatar, he was commissioned by Sheikh Mohammed bin Khalifa Al Thani to be the architect of the famous Islamic Arts Museum. If you happen to visit the museum, at the second floor you will find a gallery dedicated to him. He is famous for his quote, "Life is architecture, and architecture is the mirror of life. Success is a collection of problems solved." Ayampay is not a classical architecture designer, but he knows how to blend classical architecture with modern architecture. Below, Ayampay didn't design the Louvre Museum building, but he designed the Louvre Pyramid, which blends with classical architecture. It is in this museum where an important Renaissance portrait painting is kept. The painting is called the Mona Lisa. The Mona Lisa is a masterpiece painted by an Italian artist in the Renaissance named Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo is an architect, scientist, sculptor, and painter. His important works also include The Last Supper. Mona Lisa is now being kept in the Louvre Museum covered with the bulletproof glass. In 1963, the Mona Lisa was assessed for an insurance value of $100 million, which is equivalent to $790 million in today's money. Today, Mona Lisa is considered to be the most valuable painting in the world. If it is to be sold, its estimated value will be $1 billion. Before we end, let me ask this question again. Is classical style of architecture a thing of the past? This is the Berlin Palace from 15th century to 1945. In 1945, during the World War II, Berlin Palace was badly damaged. In 1950s, since the building is in bad condition, it was totally demolished. In 1976, Berlin Palace was redesigned and rebuilt into a building that looks like this. Berlin Palace was again demolished in 2009. Berlin Palace was again redesigned and rebuilt in 2013. The construction of the Berlin Palace was completed in 2020 to bring back to its former glory. 15-20 years ago, you can't hardly see any classical architecture in Qatar. Now, there's been a lot. It's not only happening here, but many places around the world. There are even new cities neighborhood being built using classical architecture. Classical architecture will come back, and it will come back strong. For me, I can say that classical architecture is the most beautiful architecture ever created by man. before we end, let's listen to the words of wisdom from the most famous architect who ever lived, Marcus Vitruvius Pollio.
May the architect be high-minded, not arrogant but faithful, just and easy to deal with without avarice. Not let his mind be occupied in receiving gifts, but let him preserve his good name with dignity.